Thank you so much. A state of shock is a gap that opens up between an event and our ability to understand that event. That's what a shock is. Something happens and it's so big, it's coming seemingly out of nowhere, that it doesn't fit with the world that we thought we knew. Now we can understand this on a personal level when some crisis hits us, a loss, an illness, and we go into that kind of a personal shock when we can't process the story. And what do we want to do when we go into one of those states? We want to come together. We want to connect. And we have all kinds of cultural and religious rituals that help us to do that, that help us to regain our story. We can also go into one of these states collectively when something so huge happens that we collectively can't understand it. Something like an economic meltdown, something like a war, a terrorist attack, a natural disaster, but something so big that it is a rupture in our collective narrative. That's what we mean when we say we are in shock. And when I think about how so many of us felt after September 11th, it's really interesting to go back to that moment because it was a classic state of collective shock. It was an event that hit this country that seemed to come from nowhere. It was a classic case of what Chalmers Johnson refers to as blowback. And the significance of blowback, and blowback is a CIA term, and it refers to the unintended consequences of covert action. Now, the reason why I stress the covert element is that when actions that are taken by the government that are covert, that are unknown, when blowback hits us because of those actions, it's particularly shocking precisely because we don't have the story in which to place those events, right? So if we think about how we spontaneously felt after September 11th, what did people say? They said they wanted to spend more time with their families and more time with their communities. They spontaneously gathered, debated, wanted to talk and fill that gap between event and analysis, to shake that feeling that this came from nowhere, to stop that rupture in time and space and integrate the event into a collective narrative. And we also wanted to understand where this event came from. So there was a hunger for books. And I think probably our host this evening at the wonderful Books and Books can attest to this, that people went to libraries and bookstores and they wanted to read books about the Middle East. They wanted to understand the history of Afghanistan. They wanted to know where Al-Qaeda came from. They wanted to read the Quran. They wanted the information that they believed, that we believed would fill that gap, right? So what did we hear from the Bush administration in that crucial moment, in that moment when the gap opened up between event and narrative, between event and collective story? Well, we heard two things. One, go shopping, right? Which is really the opposite of what we're doing here tonight, which is coming together to talk to one another, to try to come up with a more coherent story of how we arrived here together. I think that's what propels us to events like this. Shopping, on the other hand, and it's shopping season, as we know, doesn't tend to bring that kind of cohesiveness. I don't know about you, but I tend to feel pretty scattered through the experience of shopping. It is an essentially isolated activity, even if we do it with friends or family. The other thing we heard from the Bush administration was that impulse to integrate the terrorist attacks into a narrative, into a historical narrative, to take this event that seemed to come from nowhere and say, no, it came from somewhere. What we heard was that impulse is actually an attempt to rationalize the terrorist attack. By trying to understand this event, you are rationalizing it. You are therefore sympathizing with the terrorists, therefore on the side of the terrorists. And so that impulse to understand was cast as traitorous. And what we heard instead was this mantra: September 11th changed everything. Nothing will ever be the same. And we started hearing this separation, this rupture in time and space between pre-9/11 thinking, right, and the post-9/11 era. So that state of disorientation that was a natural response to an event that seemed to come from nowhere was deepened. And people became more disoriented. Now, what do we do in a state of shock? Well, one of the key symptoms of a state of shock is regression. It is becoming childlike and looking for protection. And that was a tremendous appeal of Bush in those days, and also of Giuliani in those days. And of course, he's now running a campaign entirely based on reminding us of when we thought he was our daddy, right? I mean, that is the gist of the campaign. And that he played that role, both Giuliani and Bush played that role tremendously effectively, that protector father figure, even though now, as we look more closely at those events, there are grave questions to be asked about what kind of protectors they really were. But the point is, they played them very effectively on TV. So regression was deepened, isolation was heightened, and that state of shock, that gap that opened up between an event and our collective story is our history, was deepened. And we got this message: history has been rebooted. We are starting over, year zero, September 12th. Everything you thought you knew no longer applies. And on this blank slate of our collective consciousness, our traumatized consciousness, we were handed new stories, new narratives, tidy new narratives, ready-made narratives like Axis of Evil, Clash of Civilizations, the war against Islamofascism. And that desire for a tidy narrative, for a story, for the need to make sense of the world, which is the most profoundly human impulse, made many of us receptive to these tidy narratives. Because if everything that we thought we knew of the world no longer applied, then we needed some story. And the fact that we had these stories was tremendously reassuring. And the fact that it was repeated over and over again in the press also added to that. So that's what shock is, and that's an example of a collective state of shock. I want to talk a little bit about what I mean by the shock doctrine and disaster capitalism, which are the key terms in the book. What I mean by the shock doctrine is a philosophy of power that I think we can identify very clearly in the Bush administration, but which I argue in the book is by no means unique to the Bush administration, and that in fact the Bush administration represents simply the culmination, or one might hope, the final expression of an ideological project that has been dominating now for 3 decades. The shock doctrine is the philosophy of power that holds that the best time to push through a radical pro-corporate economic program, what economists call shock therapy, is in the aftermath of some kind of shock, some kind of cataclysmic event. If you were to present a population with an economic shock therapy program, which means cutting healthcare, education, privatizing core services like Social Security, water, healthcare, education, deregulating in the interests of corporations, if that's what economic shock therapy does. Now, if you were to say to people when times were fairly uneventful that this was the plan, people would organize and reject it, because that's what we tend to do. We tend to protect our interests, and we may want markets, and I would argue that we do, but we have also collectively struggled since the Great Depression for policies that temper the market, that guarantee better working conditions, and that build a social safety net. So when the market fails, there's something there to catch us. This has been the project of the New Deal, the Great Society. This was the response to that crisis, the collective response to the crisis of the market crash of 1929. So people do, when times are uneventful, resist these economic measures. So what I show in the book is that if we look at the big bang moments when this pro-corporate agenda has advanced, it hasn't been hand in hand with freedom and democracy, as we're told over and over again. We can trace the rise of this ideology through shock. We can see cataclysmic events over the past 30 years, major traumas to countries, states of exception and states of emergencies that created the context in which these policies could be pushed through without debate. So in the book, I start in the 70s and the Latin American coups that overthrew democracies and created the context when the first economic shock therapy programs under the tutelage of Milton Friedman and the so-called Chicago Boys were imposed on Latin America. But I follow this through to contexts which were democracies on paper, but where these policies were pushed through against the wishes of the population, using economic crisis, using hyperinflation crises and debt crises in the 80s in Latin America and Africa, and these economic emergencies when the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank would come with a rescue loan in exchange for countries accepting these economic measures. But I also give a few other kinds of examples. I show, for instance, how Margaret Thatcher was only able to push through her economic shock therapy program, the rapid privatization of the British economy and the breaking of the blue-collar unions in the 80s after the Falklands War, which created a state of emergency. And Thatcher came back from that battle and she said, we fought the enemy without in the Falklands, and now we must fight the enemy within. And the enemy within was the trade unions. So I traced this ideology, and this was actually new to me because this book came out of my reporting in Iraq after the US invasion. I went there for Harper's Magazine and wrote an article called Baghdad Year Zero, Pillaging Iraq in Pursuit of a Neocon Utopia. And I went to Iraq because I thought what was happening there was an entirely new phenomenon. This idea of imposing economic shock therapy in the aftermath of a shock and awe invasion. I mean, in Iraq, the shock doctrine was absolutely blatant. You had a military strategy that was designed to heighten the shock, to create collective shock to the extent that it was called shock and awe. And then you had Paul Bremer arriving in Baghdad when the city was still on fire, wearing his trademark uniform, Brooks Brothers suits and army boots, the uniform of the new economy, and declaring that Iraq was open for business and pushing through a series of laws that turned Iraq into the widest open, most unprotected economy in the world. Now you have to remember that the lights were still off in Baghdad. So Iraqi industry was told they had to compete without electricity. Right? That they had to compete with Walmart in this context. So the first shock in Iraq was shock and awe. The second shock was this economic shock therapy, but it didn't go as planned. And Iraqis weren't so shocked by the invasion that they just went along with this experiment in radical social engineering. They resisted. And when they resisted, there was a third shock. And that third shock was a non-metaphorical shock, was the shock to bodies, was the shock in the interrogation chambers, was the shock of torture. And I look at torture in this book as an enforcement tool, as a political strategy that often fails to try to control populations that will not be controlled. You know, we have these debates about torture, about whether it works, whether it doesn't work, the 24 scenario, whether this particular tactic violates the Geneva Conventions, whether the Geneva Conventions apply. But so much of our discussion is narrow. It's about looking at torture as what happens between an interrogator and a prisoner, and whether it successfully extracts information. And what we forget is actually what we know about torture, which is that torture is not just about extracting information. Torture is always, no matter who uses it, a strategy for transmitting information. Torture is a tool of state terror. Torture tells a whole society, be afraid. And we get that message. We get that message. Some of us get that message more clearly than others when we know that we could be the one who could be disappeared. But we get that message. You know, we have these discussions, once again, in this country about why there's so much apathy. But it isn't just apathy. It's also fear. These tactics work, and we need to identify them as tactics designed to make us fearful so that we can resist it in ourselves. When I came back from Iraq, I found out, I actually was on, I'm on a lot of listservs, a lot of different kinds of listservs. And one day I ended up getting an email all the way from Sri Lanka, from a man named Herman Kumara, who is head of the Fishing People's Association in Sri Lanka. There's many small boat fishing people in Sri Lanka, and they're represented by an association, and Mr. Kumara is the head of this association. And this was about 3 months after the Asian tsunami swept the coasts of Sri Lanka and Thailand and Indonesia and the Maldives. And in Sri Lanka was particularly hard hit. 40,000 people were killed in the tsunami. About 500,000 people lost their homes. Overwhelmingly, they were small boat fishing people, like those represented by Herman Kumara. The subject line of the email was the second tsunami of corporate globalization and militarism. This got my attention because I was just back from Iraq. And I researched it and I looked into it. And I actually went to Sri Lanka with my husband, Avi Lewis, who's a filmmaker. And we documented how the tsunami had been used as an excuse to take the fishing people from the coast to these inland camps and really warehouse them, while the coasts were being developed very, very rapidly and handed over to resort developers. I think here in Florida you wouldn't know anything about this impulse. And so I wrote a piece called The Rise of Disaster Capitalism for The Nation magazine, looking at how, precisely because these types of policies were encountering so much resistance, it wasn't just the seizing of the coastline and handing it over to the tourism industry. 4 days after the tsunami hit, the government in Sri Lanka pushed through a bill preparing the ground for water privatization. 4 days after the tsunami hit. So obviously what the strategy was to take this incredibly controversial policy. Nothing is more controversial than water privatization in the whole pantheon of these policies. This is the most contentious because water is needed to survive. And to use that window of trauma when people were focused on their tremendous losses, on their needs to recover, to rebuild, to bury the dead, to push through this controversial law. So I wrote this piece about disaster capitalism, and I started working on the book and started researching these historical connections. And it was while I was already in this process that the levees broke in New Orleans. And I immediately went there, and what was, one of the things that was really striking is that within 10 days of the levees breaking, with the city still partially flooded, the people were using the phrase disaster capitalism to describe what was happening in real time. Because instantly, you started hearing people, I quote a Republican congressman from Baton Rouge at the start of the book, saying of New Orleans public housing projects, we couldn't clean out those housing projects, but God did. I hesitate to say that in a church because it's such blasphemy, but he did say that. And it was so clear that this disaster, which actually came out of the systematic neglect of the state, that's why the levees broke, was then harnessed to finish the job, not to rebuild the public sector, but to destroy all that was left of the public sphere, the public housing projects, and the school system. New Orleans is now the country's leading laboratory, and that's a quote from the New York Times, for the charter school model. Almost half the students in New Orleans, when they went back to school this fall, went into charter schools. Not because they had big community meetings and decided to do this, or because they had a referendum and voted for it, but precisely because the residents of New Orleans were scattered throughout the country and these policies were pushed through in that window of opportunity. That is disaster capitalism. But it's more than that, because many of you will remember hearing that immediately after the levees broke, and I was there when this happened, Blackwater showed up, saying that they were there to provide security. And it wasn't just Blackwater. It was Halliburton, Bechtel, Floor, Parsons, the whole Baghdad gang. And all of us who had reported from Iraq were having flashbacks. And so were the soldiers, and so were the private security guards. There's a friend of mine asked a Blackwater guard how things were going in the city, in New Orleans. And he looked around and he said, well, it's all pretty green zone here. He didn't know where he was. He thought he was in Baghdad. We all did. Because it was as if the green zone had lifted up from Iraq and landed on the bayou. And what is the significance of this? The significance of this is that this country has, for the past 25 years, been privatizing all of the arms of the state. Water, electricity, roads. What's left? Well, what's left is what they call core government services. Core government services are everything from first responders to the army. It's fire, it's police. It's also the running of the government itself, the infrastructure of the state, the cutting of welfare checks. I mean, it's the invisible side of government. This administration, the significance of the Bush administration, is that they are devouring the core. Not because they're crazy, but because they are just taking this ideological project to its logical conclusion. Now, I don't think there is anything particularly new about this privatization impulse. Eric Prince, the head of Blackwater, says his mission is to do for the US military what FedEx did for the post office, right? He doesn't see a difference, but there is a difference. And the difference has tremendous consequences to all of us. Now, today, as you know, a huge conference has just begun in Bali. It's a very important conference. It is a coming together of energy ministers from around the world to come up with a global agreement to replace the Kyoto Protocol, which is going to expire soon. It expires in 2010. The mandate of Bali is tremendously ambitious. It's also tremendously urgent. I don't have time here to set out the scientific case that climate change is a reality, and I doubt that I need to do that with this crowd, but if you'd like me to, we can do it more during the discussion. But there is tremendous urgency from the scientific community. The last report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which just won the Nobel Prize, was just described by Time magazine as a final warning to humanity. The stakes for Bali are very high. Yet how many of you think anything significant is going to come from Bali? Certainly from this government. I mean, I think there is a well-earned cynicism that this tremendous challenge and this moment where so much change is urgently needed, we are understandably cynical that we will see that change from our political leadership. And it isn't just the Bush administration, although the Bush administration is an extreme manifestation of this. There is a laissez-faire attitude from governments around the world. The Bush just looks bad by comparison. Now, what we hear from the administration, and we've been hearing this now for a few years, ever since they stopped denying that climate change is a reality, they went from denying that it's a reality to saying that the market will fix it. Right? That what they need to do is let capitalism harness the creativity of the free market, create incentives in the market system so that it will solve itself, essentially. And that this is better than clear regulation like firm caps on emissions. This is what we're hearing. Now, if we think about what it means to privatize so many aspects of the state that deal directly with disaster and warfare, which is what I've just described, which is really the innovation of this government, that in the shock after September 11th, they didn't just declare the endless war on terror, they simultaneously outsourced it and privatized it. So Iraq is a contractors' war. There are more private contractors in Iraq than there are soldiers, 180,000 private contractors in Iraq. And simultaneously, you have the construction of this homeland security state, which is not run by the state. The Department of Homeland Security is an empty shell. I mean, this government still plays a government on TV. They can still, have press conferences, and they have presidential seals, and they act like a government. But if you pull back the curtain, no one's home, right? And that's what we saw during Katrina, a government that wasn't home, a government that had hollowed out everything. And there was the appearance that everyone had gone on vacation, right? I mean, it's not just an appearance. This is what the administration has spent its time doing. We spend our time talking about individual corruption scandals, and we miss this larger picture of this deliberate hollowing out of the state. Now, what this means is that what Eisenhower described as the military-industrial complex has been replaced by what I call the disaster capitalism complex. And it is a huge and sprawling and ever-expanding part of not just the US economy, but the global economy, that encompasses not just the companies that produce weapons, but also the companies that are treating soldiers when they come back traumatized and maimed from Iraq. That is a business opportunity, thanks to Donald Rumsfeld, who privatized medical treatment for soldiers. They also see the growing backlash against immigrants as a market opportunity. And when you compound climate change with that and its ability to create so many migrants quickly, if we think about the floods just recently in Tabasco and Mexico or Bangladesh, climate change is a guarantee that there will be millions of people displaced from their homes looking for new homes. What will they meet when they get there? Well, they'll meet Boeing's $2.5 billion virtual fence on the borders of the US and Mexico and the US and Canada. They'll meet Halliburton's new detention centers. That they got multi-million contracts to build detention centers, privately run detention centers, in the case of an unexpected influx of migrants. They could well meet Blackwater guards who see the securing of the US border as a way to diversify their business model after Iraq. So, contrary to what the Bush administration claims about creating market incentives to develop green energies, what they have actually done is created market incentives for ongoing disasters, market incentives not to deal with the most pressing issues of our time, whether it's the need for peace in the Middle East, whether it is the need to seriously tackle our climate crisis. Instead, what we have is this privatized infrastructure that sees each disaster as a market opportunity, as an opportunity for expansion, both to put the excluded under surveillance and in detention, and offer the included, the winners of this economic model, privatized escape. You know, I would be remiss in Miami if I didn't mention that a year after Hurricane Katrina, a new company launched called HelpJet, which offered the residents of South Florida the opportunity to turn their next hurricane into a luxury vacation. You can call your HelpJet concierge, who, when the hurricane's coming, and they will not just whisk you out of the hurricane zone, no lines, no mess, no fuss, but they will book your 5-star vacation. So what we saw during Hurricane Katrina, this vision of a kind of a science fiction disaster apartheid future, where if you had money, you were able to escape, but if you depended on the state, you were left stranded. You know, and we heard, oh, this was just incompetence. It wasn't supposed to be like this, and we'll do better next time. But in fact, what's being entrenched is precisely that future, where if you can buy your way out of disasters, this is a big new market opportunity. It's the new service economy. But if you depend on the state, the can't-do state, as Paul Krugman calls it, you will be left behind. And more than that, the containing of migrants will be the next big industry. Now, here is why I have hope. I have hope because this whole infrastructure feeds on our fear. It is a fear-based economy. You know, if you watch Fox or CNN, you have so much of our media landscape devoted now to keeping us in a constant state of fear. Whether it's fear of the next terrorist attack, fear of the next climate emergency, or fear of an immigration influx. This whole economy, fear is its oxygen. It needs fear to breathe, which gives all of us a tremendous opportunity to fight the enemy, the real enemy within. The real enemy within being our own fear, our own impulse to regress, and to look for this false model of security instead of real human security, which means getting us off this political and ecological disastrous course. So when we give in to that state of fear, we are feeding this economy. When we resist it in ourselves, this is the true war resisting. This is how we cut off the oxygen of this economy. So we have far more power, I think, than we let ourselves believe sometimes. And this is one of the reasons why I don't use words like fascism to describe this moment in history, because I think that these are fear words, and these are words that tell us the war's already been lost. You know, if we're living in a fascist state, you know, we may as well just hide and stay quiet, because there is no room for dissent in a fascist state. In a fascist state, I can't write books like this, and we can't gather in spaces like this, but we can. And we still have these spaces left. And so instead of using them to make ourselves more afraid, instead of using those spaces to tell ourselves that we don't have rights, we need to use these spaces to expand our feelings of freedom and our feelings of possibility, because this is a, I don't want to downplay the threat and I don't want to overplay the threat. It is serious. This is a moment to act. It is a moment to change course. At the same time, it is a moment where we still have that power and that ability to change course. So when it comes to these freedoms, I feel very strongly that we are at that moment where we use them or we lose them. And I hope that you will use them with me. Thank you. Some time to have a good chat, and then we're going to watch a very short film, and I'm going to be here to sign your books, so we're just getting started. But thank you so much. Who wants to ask the first question? In the book, as I said, I talk about the whys behind the uses of these extreme terror tactics. And one of the things I argue in the book is that we often, when we talk about human rights violations, whether it's this administration or the Latin American juntas of the 70s, who were really the prototype, the first governments to impose these radical free market policies, we often talk about human rights violations in isolation from the broader political and economic agenda that they serve. So the phrase I use in the book is that the mistake that was made by the human rights movement in Latin America in the 70s is that they treated Latin America like a murder scene when in fact it was the site of an extraordinarily violent armed robbery. And I think the same is true for Iraq today, that the violence serves a purpose. And the dream, I almost called the book Blank is Beautiful. And the reason why I almost called it that is because as I've researched the rise of this market fundamentalism, this idea of the blank slate has come up again and again and again. In the 70s in Latin America, the Chicago boys would talk about how the coups had given them a clean sheet on which to build their model states. And when I was in New Orleans, immediately after the flood, I was hearing that phrase again. Talking to developers with this city still flooded, saying, well, we now have a clean sheet, and on that clean sheet we can rebuild. Now, of course, New Orleans in that moment was anything but a clean sheet. It was filled with rubble and bodies, and it was anything but a clean sheet. But it's this confusion between destruction and creation, and this dream, actually, that these terrible disasters actually don't destroy but cleanse. This is an idea, and actually I do feel comfortable talking about this in a church. In fact, I think we should talk about this more in churches and synagogues, which is that this is a really deep part of our Judeo-Christian mythology. This fantasy that our world can be cleansed through disasters. It's in Noah and the flood, and this idea that you've got problems with the world, flood it, grab a few of your friends, get on a boat, start over, right? Reboot. And it is the appeal of the rapture narrative, right? There are other ideas in our religious texts. There is the idea in the Old Testament of tikkun olam, of mending and repairing the world, which is a very different impulse. It's not starting over from scratch. It's actually repairing what is there. But we do have these very powerful ideas of great cleansings, great floods, great fires, and starting over. And it's a very big part of our colonial myth. And the idea on which our countries were founded, that there was empty land somewhere, and terra nullius, as they called it, a blank sheet where you could get rid of all the problems of the old world and start over in the new world. But there never were any empty lands. So that impulse to start again, The flip side of the blank slate is and has always been the scorched earth. It's a violent idea, even though it can present itself as an idealistic one, right? It can present itself as a utopian impulse for perfect beauty, balance, and renewal. There are no empty lands, there are no blank slates, we're stuck here together, we have to make this work. So I think that that's the context in which I was talking about. That's when the urge to cleanse and blank the slate through force kicks in, because the world doesn't comply with these dangerous fantasies of erasure. You know, I guess where I see that change, that positive change emerging most clearly is in Latin America now, which I think makes a lot of sense because Latin America really was the laboratory for so many of these policies. The continent has seen every form of disaster capitalism, the exploiting of coups, the debt crisis, price shocks, hyperinflation crises, and also gloves off disaster capitalism, starting with Hurricane Mitch and how Hurricane Mitch was used by the bank and the fund, as I'm sure you know, to push through water, electricity privatization, and really regressive land reform policies. So Latin America really has seen it all and saw it all first. And that, I think, is part of the reason why the alternatives to policies which in Latin America are called neoliberalism, are arriving there first. And there are many examples. In terms of alternatives to the bank has changed the way it talks, but I don't believe the bank has changed the way it thinks. Even though Paul Wolfowitz lost his job, he was replaced promptly by Robert Zoellick, who is Bush's former trade envoy. Seriously bad news, and is pushing much more privatization at the bank. And it's one of the problems that I have with so much of the way we've been doing politics in the Bush era. It's so personality-based. You get obsessed with a Rumsfeld or a Wolfowitz, and then their dismissal is seen as a victory. They're replaced with somebody who's continuing their policies like Gates or Zoellick, but who's slightly lower profile, and we all stop paying attention. It isn't just about people, it's about a logic, and that's what I'm trying to identify here. I think that that's what we were talking about before September 11th, and that there was a really powerful global discussion going on, and the protests outside the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and the World Trade Organization were a part of that global awakening. And Latin America has kept that conversation going even as we have changed the subject. So concretely, one of the things that's starting to become quite concrete is the idea of what's the Banco del Sur, the Bank of the South, which would make the need to go to Washington for emergency loans and bailouts no longer necessary, because there would be a Bank of Latin America, and Latin American countries are increasingly loaning to each other. Obviously, Venezuela's oil money is a huge part of this, but it isn't the only piece of it, and that's where I'm drawing. I think we're seeing some concrete alternatives there. ALBA, the trade area, is another one. I write about this, actually I did in a recent article in The Nation, if people want to read about it, called Latin America's Shock Resistance. The Chilean myth, well, there's a couple pieces of that. There were, the Allende administration was in an economic crisis at the time of the coup, but it was an economic crisis that was deliberately created. Henry Kissinger famously said when Allende won the vote, "Make the economy scream." And it was a classic embargo strategy and a classic strategy of extraordinary economic sabotage, headed by U.S. companies like ITT, but also Chilean companies that were against Allende's administration, and they did make the economy scream. So that argument that the coup was responding to an economic crisis created by Allende is false. The coup was responding to an economic crisis created by Nixon and Kissinger and the elites in Chile. Now, you mentioned copper, and I do talk about this in the book. It's one of the point about philosophy. I don't talk about Strauss in the book. I talk about Friedman. But I think it's true that it really shouldn't rightly be called a philosophy. It's a strategy. It's a Machiavellian strategy of power. It isn't a philosophy. I also don't think it's really an ideology. And this is one of the problems I have is, you know, there is an ideological framework which Milton Friedman laid out, which is, you know, for totally unfettered free markets. But if we look at the actual track record of these ideologues in power, what we see is there's tremendous support for state interference in the economy when it benefits multinationals, right? And I think Alan Greenspan's legacy is the best example, that he intervened in the economy in the interests of hedge funds again and again. He did not intervene in the economy in the interests of regular people, and, you know, we're seeing this again in the subprime mortgage crisis. So it doesn't even deserve to be called an ideology, because they break the rules when it suits them. Now, Chile is a really classic example of this, because it was this ideological laboratory, this petri dish for all of these policies straight out of the Chicago economic school playbook, like school vouchers, charter schools, privatization of Social Security, the depoliticization of the union movement, not allowing unions to be involved in political activity, a 15% flat tax. They even called it an ownership society. This was the 70s, right? And all of these policies that the Bush administration had tried and failed to bring in, they brought in Chile in the 70s. That said, the whole thing was underwritten with public money. Does that sound familiar? In the form of Codelco, the state copper mine. Codelco is the centerpiece of the Chilean economy. It is what Allende nationalized, which so enraged the American copper companies. But Pinochet and the Chicago boys never privatized Codelco. And at key moments, Codelco represented 87% of Chile's exports, just a massive part of the economy that was subsidizing all of these experiments, which were then held up as this great free market model. You know, it was Saudi Arabia, 90% of their revenues come from the nationalized oil. And Chile, under Pinochet, was about as free a market as Saudi Arabia is. So I hope that answers the question. Colombia, very good. You know, it is true that I don't deal with Colombia enough, except to say that I actually believe that all roads lead to Colombia, in the sense that what we're building in Iraq and Afghanistan and what the sort of end game is, it's not peace. It's low-level war, dampened down enough to be able to do resource extraction, but a constant state of emergency that creates the context for avoiding real democracy. And that is what Colombia has. And I think that the role of the threat of terrorism has been tremendously useful to the right in Colombia. And if we look at the way the Uribe government uses FARC, and the way the Bush administration uses FARC to rationalize this whole set of policies, then we actually see something quite similar to what the way in which the Bush administration uses the threat of terror at home. It's a tremendously useful low-level threat to have. And I am talking about specifically the harnessing of crises, the harnessing of disasters, to push through a political program, and this political program is the integration of corporations and businesses. I'm not talking about the inherent flaws in a capitalist system that create those crises spontaneously, I mean, that's actually a different analysis. It's a more classic Marxist analysis, and I have a great deal of respect for it. But I'm talking about a more deliberate political strategy than just the ways in which crises are built into a market system. I believe that they are, but I also believe that it is possible to have a far less disastrous market system than the one we have. and that what we've been living for the past 30 years really is a counter-revolution against the idea of a mixed economy. The idea that you can have an economy that has a market, but also has elements of socialism within that system, like socialized medicine, like a public education system, like a post office and a library, and all of these things that actually don't fit the market logic. You know, the way I think about what we've been living these past 3 decades is that what we had from the Great Depression through the post-war boom was capitalism in its seductive phase. It's capitalism that knew that it had rival suitors for our attention. And you know, this is what the New Deal was, a compromise. It was a response to the fact that many Americans were turning to more radical left-wing ideas, and there was a clear sense from the elites in this country that they had to sweeten the deal if people weren't going to turn left. And that is what the New Deal was. And so that this era of the mixed economy was really, it was capitalism with flowers and chocolates, saying, you know, we can make this work. And the phase that we've been living lately is sort of the post-1989, since there are no rival suitors, it's just sort of capitalism splayed out on the couch in a dirty undershirt going, what are you going to do, leave me? And saying, more than that, you know, all those gifts I gave you, I want them back. I want the flowers and the chocolates back. So, I mean, that's my analysis of where we are. Whether it's possible to redeem it and whether we need a completely other economic model, I don't pretend to know. I mean, that's actually not the research or the writing that I do. I have great faith that we can answer that question together. The financial crisis will be exploited to push through the policies that the Bush administration was not able to push through without a crisis. Social Security. I mean, Bush went on a listening tour. People told him to shut up, right? All in a context of an economic emergency, all of these ideas reemerge. Alan Greenspan, after 18 years as head of the Federal Reserve, overseeing this gulf opening up between the haves and have-nots. You know, when Reagan took office, CEOs earned 43 times more than their workers. When Alan Greenspan left the Federal Reserve, they were making more than 400 times more. I asked Alan Greenspan about this when I had the opportunity to sort of interview him on Democracy Now! And he blamed teachers. He blamed the school system, you know? Because these are the next big pushes. It's Social Security, and it's school vouchers and charter schools. And all we need to do if we want to see the future is go to the Heritage Foundation's website and read what the ideas are that are lying around. You know, I start the book with this quote from Milton Friedman: "Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When the crisis occurs, the change will depend on the ideas that are lying around." So if we want to know what's going to happen, check out the ideas that are lying around. But we also need to have our ideas lying around, because, you know, in fact, this whole model, you know, Friedman's obsession with crisis, in fact, had to do with his observation that progressives had responded to the market crash of 1929 with a wave of populism, which is the opposite of what I'm describing, which is using a crisis to blast people out of the way and ram through policies. The Great Depression was an opportunity to bring more people into the political process and build a more just economic system. So we have paradigms for how crises and disasters can create more democracy, more participation. And there are many other examples of that. It happened in Mexico after the 1985 earthquake. It became a democratic opening up because in that moment people lost faith in the state. They saw such tremendous evidence of inequality in the way the earthquake hit different people and the way the government failed to respond, and it was a tremendous opening up. In terms of the new paradigm that we need, I think it does really need to go deep. And I mean, I'm a social democrat, and I think that we need to we need to have confidence in our alternatives in these moments of key crisis, that when you have a disaster like Katrina, that is clearly an indictment of this ideology of neglecting the public sphere, to the extent that the levees break and the public transit system fails. It was not just that the right was opportunistic in that moment and pushed through privatization of the hospitals and the school system. Where were we? You know, where were we in this moment when the ideology failed so graphically before the world? Where were we with our confidence proposing another and more just economic model? And that has to do with an internalized belief among progressives that while we can criticize the right, we think there's something wrong with our ideas. And that is the flip side of this ideological campaign by the right, which is to say our ideas have already failed. There's something tainted about them. There's something wrong with them. So in those key moments when we need great confidence, the moment when we collectively lose the story, we don't have the confidence to come forward with our narratives, with our alternatives, and we get frightened. And so we need to identify this in ourselves. I really believe that we don't face a crisis of ideas, that we face a crisis of faith in our ideas, a crisis of confidence in our ideas. And it's one of the things that I try to do in the book. And I really have two goals or two tracks with this alternative history. One is to show how crisis was used at key junctures, whether the Tiananmen Square massacre, the coups in the 70s, or the economic crises, but also to show that what Margaret Thatcher claimed, there is no alternative, was not true. That at each one of these crises, at each one of these junctures, there were ideas, there were alternatives that people voted for, that they wanted, and they didn't fail. They didn't have a chance to fail because they were shocked out of the way in these key junctures. And that's, you know, I'm referring to everything from the African National Congress's economic program that they were voted into office to implement in 1994, but then the leadership lost their nerve and never even tried it. So, you know, we have all of these examples where, you know, and Allende is, of course, the best example. His economic vision was not, that experiment was not allowed to be fulfilled. It was shocked out of the way. So when we know this history, it's not just a question of pointing fingers and saying you used violence, you used coercive Machiavellian tactics. It's also to say our ideas didn't have the chance that they deserved. And when we know that, then we become more confident in these key moments. But the paradigm is more than that. I think the paradigm does come back to this fantasy of escape, this fantasy that we can somehow reboot the world from zero. And this is why this is not just a right-wing issue. The left has indulged in the same fantasies of starting over. And I think if we look to the paradigms that will lead us out of this thinking, they are more indigenous visions of the world, which sees, you know, I'm going to get a little bit flaky here, but sees life as a cycle. And, you know, we are stuck here. We will not be airlifted with a few of our friends out of the mess that we have created. And there's no ark, there's no rapture, there's just us. We're stuck here together. And when we accept that, So that's where my new paradigm starts. No escape. Just us. This has been a really fantastically stimulating discussion, and I have the clear sense that it could go on for a lot longer. And it's really, really been a wonderful experience for me, and I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank Books and Books for putting it on.